The Prime Minister arriving in Johannesburg for a summit that's supposed to be with leaders representing 2/3 of the world's population.
The United States is not participating in official talks.
Attention! This G20 summit in Johannesburg is not just a meeting of the great powers, but a real battle for global economic leadership, in which Canada suddenly found itself at the crest of the wave. While the whole world held its breath, one great power unexpectedly disappeared from the radar, leaving behind a huge power vacuum. With the US refusing to attend, Canada has an unprecedented opportunity to rewrite the global rules of the game, and it has no intention of letting it slip away. Have you ever wondered how you could successfully change the global balance of power just by being in the right place at the right time? That's exactly what Prime Minister Carney did, seemingly sitting quietly into his office in Ottawa while business shock unfolded around him. His team made dozens of secret phone calls and arranged meetings with the leaders of the world's largest economies, all while Trump and his administration were painfully embroiled in diplomatic scandals. However, these were not just diplomatic visits for photo ops, but a carefully crafted strategy that experts are already calling a reset of world trade. Rivals say it's a game without the US, like chess without a queen. But what if the queen is simply replaced by an army of colorful pieces? Canada's shift toward new allies such as France, India, and European countries, and especially its quiet but extremely significant rapprochement with Qatar, all point to the emergence of a powerful new economic coalition. It would seem impossible to talk about trade and investment with India at the same time as the media is full of news about accusations of espionage and conspiracy. Yes, the Canadian government is playing a very complex game, separating politics and economics and showing other countries that national interests do not always coincide with emotions and loud statements. And that's not all. Among the main topics on the agenda is the development of industries that will form the foundation of the future economy. From rare minerals that are vital for the production of high-tech gadgets to the enormous investment potential of sovereign wealth funds. Carney is negotiating the expansion of an important trading bloc that could reshape global supply chains, shifting US influence in the Asian and European regions. These secret games are the real diplomacy of the future, where sustainability and diversification are placed above past dogmas. While Europe and Asia are trying to figure out how to respond to these sudden changes, and the American media is putting on a show around Trump's absence, Canada is methodically building its future, laying the bricks of a new world trade architecture one step at a time. And already the dark clouds of American instability against the backdrop of trade wars and sanctions are simply fueling Canadian leadership. Get ready to see how one country, without claiming first place, can force the whole world to rethink its priorities and rebuild global alliances. This is a story about courage, strategy, and the advantage of those who know how to wait for their moment and use it to the fullest. Welcome to a new era of the global economy. Welcome to Canada Next. At the beginning of 2025, the global economic scene was in a state of profound turmoil and uncertainty. Last year's economic crisis, waves of protectionist measures, and the collapse of many international trade agreements created a kind of chaos that was waiting to be resolved. In this context, the G20 summit in Johannesburg was not just another meeting of the leaders of the world's largest economies. It became the symbolic center of a new world order, the epicenter of the struggle to define the vector of global development. The uniqueness of the event was compounded by the fact that, for the first time in history, the main players, the US, led by Donald Trump, boycotted the summit, leaving a vacuum of power and influence that instantly became a magnet for other powers. It was no secret that the absence of the US at the G20 caused skepticism and widespread discussion around the world. Experts and analysts predicted diplomatic collapse and protracted negotiations without a key leader, while markets braced for another wave of instability. However, it was precisely this challenge that became the starting point for the Canadian strategy, which unexpectedly and methodically approach the issue from a different angle. Prime Minister Carney, stepping into this gap in world politics, made a fundamental decision not just to observe, but to take active measures. Instead of waiting for the old systems to collapse, he launched an ambitious plan to create a new economic pole based on diversifying trade, attracting investment, and strengthening diplomatic ties, in stark contrast to America's chaotic and aggressive rhetoric. Sources close to Carney's team claim that large-scale preparations began as early as January 2025, including secret negotiations with representatives of more than a dozen major economies, with the aim of filling the void left by Washington. Among the surprising but unconfirmed rumors is that in March of this year, one of the European countries, which had previously been skeptical of Canada's strategy, unexpectedly proposed the creation of a joint investment fund for projects in Africa under the joint patronage of Canada and regional leaders. There is also talk that on the sidelines of multilateral meetings, Carney presented preliminary proposals for the development of critical minerals. In particular, Canadian lithium and cobalt deposits are of genuine interest to several Asian giants that are keen to reduce their dependence on China. All this insider information only confirms how carefully thought out and consistent the Canadian government's approach has been. At the same time, the challenge posed by the U.S. has intensified on the ideological front. Trump's vociferous accusations against South Africa regarding the persecution of white farmers, which have been repeatedly refuted by officials and considered more of a diversionary tactic, have only fueled tensions in the international arena. But unlike these empty words, Carney and his team preferred to let their actions speak for themselves, organizing dozens of bilateral meetings that were more significant than traditional photo ops. Canadian diplomacy proved that results can be achieved without fanfare and excessive media attention. Against the backdrop of the unfolding political drama in Johannesburg, it was Canada that became the invisible but powerful engine that managed to unite key countries around new topics, from technology and investment exchange to sustainable development and infrastructure development. It is said that negotiations with India have become extremely important, despite ongoing mistrust, due to last year's allegations of activities detrimental to Canada's security. However, it is precisely this pragmatic approach, putting national interest above political differences, that demonstrates a new level of international relations in which Carney clearly feels at home. It was an era when traditional patterns were no longer working, and a new generation of statesmen was coming to the fore, for whom the phrase strategic autonomy took on real meaning. The fact that most of the major players, including France, the European Union, Qatar, and the Scandinavian countries, recognized Canada's leadership in coordinating and creating new economic alliances speaks to the transformation of the global balance of power. While Trump was once again flaming on social media, the world was quietly building new ties, making Canada one of the key centers of attraction in an era of post-American uncertainty. Canada, which had shown its determination and foresight in the previous stages of preparation for the G20 summit, took the lead in Johannesburg, demonstrating that its strategic game is much deeper than simply reacting to the absence of the U.S. Now, it is not just filling the void, but creating a new axis of influence, using meetings and negotiations as tools to build long-term relationships and structural coalitions. The key insight is that these meetings were not random. Each had a clear purpose, not just friendly conversations, but concrete steps to strengthen economic and political ties with key global players. Internal sources in the government report that Prime Minister Carney's schedule included a series of in-depth and lengthy negotiations with the heads of state and government of France, Norway, the European Union, Germany, and the United Kingdom, countries that together represent a significant portion of global GDP and influential economic institutions. Interestingly, rumor has it that one of these meetings raised the issue of joint financing of infrastructure projects spanning several continents, including Africa and Latin America. In particular, an ambitious initiative was put forward to create a green supply corridor that would connect European countries with Canadian resources, processed and transported using environmentally friendly technologies. According to insiders, these plans are not just talk. Preliminary memoranda of intent were signed behind the scenes, paving the way for more ambitious agreements after the summit. Analysts say these documents could mark the beginning of a real transformation in the fields of energy and renewable energy technologies, involving not only Western countries, but also the so-called Global South countries, which have often been left out of economic processes in the past. Even more intriguing was the fact that Carney was able to secure a meeting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, despite high-profile political disagreements over security issues and accusations against India. This is a purely pragmatic move, reflecting the same line described above. When it comes to national interests, ideological differences take a back seat. Behind closed doors, according to unofficial reports, discussions took place on a potential visit by Carney to India, which would symbolize a reset in bilateral relations, as well as possible steps toward joint development and export cooperation in the field of rare and strategically important minerals. There were also some surprising details. One of the participants hinted that during the conversation in the corridors, there were discussions about creating an export hub in South Asia, which could strengthen Canada's position in the region and become a logistics hub for the supply of critical resources and technologies, not only to India, but also to neighboring countries. Such a project could significantly expand Canada's geopolitical influence, strengthening its status not only as a supplier, but also as an active regional partner with prospects for long-term integration. Overall, the meetings went far beyond classic diplomatic protocols and reflected a new reality in which global players did not simply exchange pleasantries, but built strategic alliances for joint development and strengthening their positions in the global economy. This is confirmed not only by the official agenda, but also by the unofficial signals coming from Carney's entourage, including repeated statements about the creation of working groups on key areas: investment, trade, and technological cooperation. It is important to emphasize that these negotiations and meetings are not simply an attempt to form short-term agreements, but part of a broader concept aimed at creating a sustainable and diversified trade and investment base for Canada and its partners. Canadian experts note that this approach allows the country not only to protect itself in the face of growing instability in traditional trade routes, but also to lay the foundation for new economic blocs that will be less vulnerable to political fluctuations and external shocks. In this sense, negotiations with key partners have become a kind of training ground for developing mechanisms that can be used in the future to create larger-scale agreements and integrations. This approach demonstrates that Canada is pursuing a path of active diplomacy based on pragmatism and backed by economic motivation. At the same time, in contrast to the long-standing tradition of protracted and convoluted negotiations, there is an atmosphere of real action and concrete proposals. In summary, Canada's strategy at the G20 exceeded expectations and traditional notions of the role of a middle power in international relations. Instead of simply adapting to global trends and hoping for favorable circumstances, Canada has initiated a new course that combines diplomatic flexibility, economic acumen, and political restraint. Thus, these meetings became not just a demonstration of strength, but a real tool for rebuilding global partnerships, strengthening economic security, and expanding influence. All this took place against the backdrop of the famous absence of the United States, which, as events have shown, turned out to be a blessing in disguise for Canada itself and its far-sighted leadership. When discussing the goals and results of Canada's remarkable diplomatic activity at the G20 in Johannesburg, it is important to understand that Prime Minister Mark Carney faced challenges that were not merely tactical in nature, but strategic in scope. These goals were carefully formulated with the broader geopolitical picture and economic outlook in mind. And despite the media's emphasis on the quiet and professional nature of Canada's approach, they concealed an incredibly ambitious program.